Hi there everyone, welcome to part 2 of my advanced video talk on radios. In this video, I would like to talk about firmware, the actual, the program that's running on your radio and why that is important. When you come to deciding what radio to buy, how the firmware that's on it may play a part. If you, again, really on a tight budget, will basically no point just continuing on, because you'll be stuck with whatever firmware you have on these cheap radios. They've got no means of updating the firmware or changing the firmware. Again, firmware is just the program that runs on these radios. So if that's the radio that you're after, well then that you're stuck with that. Similarly, more expensive brands like, say, your Spectrum, the firmware that's running on the Spectrum radios, that's all kept in-house and stuff like that. People can't change it, so I don't know if you can even update it, but you're stuck with that firmware. So you have to be happy with the firmware and all that offers on your radio. So again, here talking about firmware. Okay, you have factory firmware. So the cheap radios or your Spectrum, but even not so cheap radios, like as I said, your Spectrum or your Futabas and stuff like that, they all have factory firmware that users can't change. If they do have updates, then there'll be updates from the factory. That's been the case too with all the new i series from Turnigy. So your i6 and your i10, they have upgradable firmware, but that firmware has to be written by the Turnigy people. The second type of firmware here is your open firmware or your custom firmware. Now, open firmware is a firmware, well, I guess it all started with the 9X, Turnigy 9X, a super fantastic radio when it came out. Admittedly, it was a copy, but the firmware, the program that was running on it was absolute rubbish. And so some smart boffins got together and they rewrote the firmware, and it's made it into an outstanding radio as far as functionality goes. Okay, so that's probably a good place to keep going on here. Radios don't have to be expensive if you're prepared to put in the work. And the Turnigy 9X is a great example. From the factory, with the factory firmware, it's a very cheap radio, 60, well, I think it's now like $70 US. Okay, some simple modifications to install some open or custom firmware. It goes, well, the ones in particular are the names ER9X or OpenTX. You get a very powerful radio. Okay, and so what? Well, this is a board from inside a 9X. Now, inside all your radios, you will have a microprocessor. Okay, so you've got a microprocessor there, same as you have on any of your tank control boards. Here's an old LMOD board. There's the processor. Here's an ASP. There's the processor. So you've got processors here operating how your tank functions. You've bought yourself a radio. If you've got decent firmware, you then open up the possibility of utilizing all the processing power on this second processor to change how your tank operates. So I think that's a very important thing. You're doubling the processing power available to you in control of your tank if you can access and properly access the processor that's in your radio as well. So you're getting twice as much for your money. If you just think nothing of it, that processing power there is practically being wasted. So why not put that to use for all your tanks? It's just kind of makes a bit of sense to me. And then you've only bought one radio, so if you've got 10 tanks, you've got twice the processing power, but instead of buying 20 processors, you've got your 10 tank processors and then the processor on your radio. Okay, so probably should go on. Well, I'm going to talk mostly here about ER9X and ER Sky 9X because that's the firmware I tend to use. But you know, a lot of people also like OpenTX and other variants of that. But I'll go back here to the Turnigy. Okay, the Turnigy is a great radio, like, to start with. It's cheap, so you can buy it for $70. Okay, and then you slowly add on to it. Just like everyone's happy to upgrade their tank, and you know, think nothing about spending money to get this, spending money to get that, but you're only upgrading one tank. If you get a 9X radio and upgrade that, you're upgrading one radio, but that radio can then be used for all of your other tanks. You know, so it's, as far as economics go, it's a really smart thing to do as far as, you know, as I can see. You know, you start first up by installing the custom firmware. Now, a lot of you may not like soldering, so there's companies that make special boards that you can just, I'll just cut this guy apart here and turn him around, you know, that you don't have to solder in, although the soldering in is not really all that hard. Here is my 9X, and it's got a 9X stream board fitted into it. It's not a very difficult process to do. It just pops in and you screw these things in, follow the instructions. Also, again, with the 9X, very simple to replace the lever here to get dual centering gimbals. So this is, you know, so then you've got access to a wide range of firmware once you put it on there. It's got a spot for an SD card. Very important. SD cards, if you, again, looking for a radio with an SD card, brilliant, because that means you're able to swap models, easily install other firmware and so forth. You know, this is a fully tricked out 9X. So I've got my 9X stream in there. I've got additional 3-position switches and a 6-position switch. Oh, it's out of focus, out of camera up there. So this has got everything. There's the 6-position switch up the top, this unit up here. And it's also got the factory Turnigy radio module there and an FR Sky module in the back. So I can control 2 different types of receiver with this radio. Now when we turn him on, I don't like turning them on with them not put up. Okay, so we turn them on.
Welcome to ER Sky 9X.
So again, I'm going to start having problems now with my focus. So I'll just, there we go, we'll concentrate on the screen there. Okay, so again, depending on the firmware, it'll also be the ease of use. Now, I particularly like this firmware because it tells me straight away on this screen all of my, you know, position for what everything is doing. Also, this firmware, you've got, remember from yesterday's video, you can have your telemetry displayed. As you see, I've got nothing showed up. My GPS coordinates are just flashing, and there's no voltages down there. So when you look at your firmware, you need to see what, you know, what the firmware offers and stuff like that. Okay, now let's have a look at the Tyrannus. On my Tyrannus, well, Tyrannus, when you get that from the factory, they will have installed OpenTX. Now, there's a reason why I like ER Sky 9X, and that is because the main developer of ER Sky 9X has listened to us tankers. He has made some changes that we've requested in ER Sky 9X to make it, well, more tank friendly. So that's why one reason why I particularly like ER Sky 9X and ER 9X as your custom firmware. It's not that hard to change your Tyrannus from OpenTX to ER Sky 9X or your QX7, and if you keep the same firmwares all the way, well, keep using the same version of the firmware, then it makes it a lot simpler for you. You don't have to learn different things. Okay, so we just fire up the Tyrannus.
Sky 9X. Bulldog.
Okay, you've got lots of fun features with your Tyrannus. You know, you got your splash screens, and then you can have, you know, little bitmaps of whatever tank you want. Have quickly go into the firmware itself. It's all fairly well laid out. There's now a good manual, and this is what I mean about, okay, if you have a look at that, you can see all the categories there. Now bring in a different radio. This is my 9XR. Okay, you can see that we have the exact same or very similar layout. So it's not once you've learnt it on one, you can then transfer it to all other radios. So these are two completely different brand radios, but the firmware on it is pretty much the same, so there's no learning different lots of firmware. Okay. Also, you can easily transfer models you've made on your Tyrannus across to the 9X, or from your 9X across to your Tyrannus.